Appreciate you joining the webinar today on specialty drugs. I know that for the number of participants that have signed up for this, this is really a hot topic. It has been for our clients for the last year, and this is something that Greg and I have been talking about for the last 2 or 3 years about this train that's been coming down the track, and now it's here in terms of specialty drugs and the costs and how you control that. And I think that particularly this year, I think that everybody is aware of the new Hep C drugs, Sovaldi, that have come out to the market, and this drug probably has already hit your bottom line in terms of the drug spend that you have on specialty. So what we want to do is, and there are other drugs that are in the pipeline, and we'll talk about more of that during the presentation about some of the drugs that are in the pipeline and things that you should be thinking about doing now as those drugs do come to the market in the next few years, because there are certain things you should be thinking about doing and certain plan designs you should be implementing to make sure that you're not hit with a lot of these costs or down the road. But the first slide we have here is sort of an overview of the various topics that we're going to be talking about the next hour, and I hope we get a chance to get through all of it because there's a lot here. But really what we wanted to do is kind of give a broad overview of the specialty field, what's going on, and things that you can do. So the next slide, I'm going to have Greg talk a little bit about what a specialty drug is, because that's really an important thing for all of us to think about or know as you're making decisions.
Thanks, Michael. So this is Greg Madsen, and appreciate everyone joining our webinar today. So really, you think about what is a specialty drug. Well, for most of you, I suspect when you look at the top 5 or 6 of your most expensive drugs that you currently have on your plan design, I would guess, if you maybe cover Crestor, you maybe cover Nexium, but other than those 2, the next 3 or 4 are specialty drugs. They're probably Enbrel and Humira for rheumatoid arthritis, and you most likely will have Copaxone, Avonex, or Betaseron for multiple sclerosis, or you may actually have Gleevec in there for cancer. I suspect a lot of you will have these specialty drugs in your top 5, 6 of your most expensive drugs. But what really differentiates a lot of times these specialty drugs is a lot of times they're derived from kind of living organisms. They're kind of grown or type thing as opposed to just being a chemical that's reproduced. So they have this kind of very specific molecular process to them and kind of how they all go. There's a lot of therapeutic and they don't really have any generic equivalents to them since they are kind of each individualized and kind of developed. So there's what's going on in the marketplace. But specialty drugs in general have some typical characteristics. Typically they're injectable, or they may be infused right through a physician's office or something. They're usually they're distributed from specialty pharmacies, physicians' offices, etc. There's a lot of patient management, self-management of these things because people are pretty, if they have multiple sclerosis, they know they have that. They got a pretty specific disease that they need to really take care of and handle. There's usually pretty limited availability for a lot of this stuff. It's limited exclusive product availability, where you can get them from, who can carry them. And there's a lot of special handling. A lot of these are refrigerated. They need to be kept refrigerated and kept cool. So there's a lot of issues there. Costs in a lot of cases are over $600 for a 30-day supply, which is really the Medicare extension. Some of those, gosh, can range $2,000, $3,000, $10,000 a month for medication, so it can get very expensive. And they're also subject to something called risk evaluation and mitigation strategies, or REMS, which is something that the manufacturers then have the pharmacies and the physicians and stuff all comply with to make sure that these drugs are being utilized appropriately and that the side effects of them get managed, because in a lot of cases these specialty drugs have some really bad side effects to them. So that's really important from a clinical management, specialty management, utilization of these drugs, that they really get cared for specifically, and that you have, in a lot of cases, a very specific specialty pharmacy that's working with the patients to make sure that they get their medications correctly and they're taking them, they understand all their side effects. So with that question, I guess we have something. Kelly, could you bring up the question where we actually ask, how many people have a specialty pharmacy exclusive arrangement in place now versus allowing your members to go to any pharmacy they want to get their specialty drugs? Okay, so it looks like it's about 60-40 or so. 60% have kind of an exclusive arrangement, and 40% of you or so still have an open arrangement, right? And that's something we'll talk a little bit about more today about, the value of having an exclusive pharmacy, especially pharmacy arrangement, to do some of the clinical programs that we talk about. So here's kind of the final results, as it comes through. The advantage of having kind of an exclusive specialty arrangement from a pharmacy perspective is that, the specialty pharmacies in a lot of cases are trained, they have pharmacists that will be trained specifically in the disease state. So if you have oncology, if you have multiple sclerosis, if you have, rheumatoid arthritis, you have specially trained pharmacists that can work with your members and participants to make sure that they're utilizing the medication appropriately, that the physicians understand, all the REMS that I talked about here, right, and what's going on there. There's just a lot of value in having that exclusive arrangement going on, as opposed to various pharmacies filling the prescriptions for you from from an overall clinical perspective, as well as in a lot of cases a cost perspective as well.
As most of you probably have experienced there, and have probably read in the press, there's been a tremendous growth in the cost of specialty drugs and the use of specialty drugs over the last several years. I remember, when I started at CVS Caremark about 12 years ago, when I first started working for them, the specialty drug list was sort of like an afterthought to the PBM contract, and there were very, very few drugs that were, really included on that list, other than probably something for rheumatoid arthritis or MS and a few other drugs for hemophilia. But because of the growth of the specialty drug industry, that list and the cost of those drugs have really gone up. And I think that if you look at all the press, the various reports that are out there, they all say that it is expected that the annual prescription drug cost for a plan sponsor is going to increase on an annual basis by about 20%, and that's sort of what we've seen for a lot of our clients. And to kind of give you an idea, for example, in 2012, the U.S. spent about $87 billion on specialty drugs and biologics, which is a lot of money. But between now and the next 6 years, you're looking at over $400 billion just on specialty drugs, and that is really where pharmacy is headed. In the coming years, it's going to be all about generics and going to be all about specialty drugs and the cost of those drugs. And the reality is that probably in the next 3 to 4 years, what you're going to see is half of your drug spend is going to be on specialty drugs. While that may only represent a very, very small portion, maybe 5% of the overall claims that you may have from a pharmacy side, you can expect that that's going to be about half of your drug spend. And so it's one of those things that you need to think about is about, okay, well, how do I control, what do I need to do to make sure that I can still provide an affordable healthcare benefit, particularly on the pharmacy side. If this becomes 50% of my drug spend, what do I need to do? The next thing I wanted to put a slide in here is because we get a lot of questions about, well, why are specialty drugs so expensive? I mean, every day you probably pick up the paper and somebody's saying, well, Congress is trying to look at this. How do we, why are drugs so expensive? And part of it is that with all the number of brand drugs that are typically given in mail and retail that are losing their patent protection, really where the focus is on these really unique disease states on the specialty side, and that's where pharmaceutical manufacturers are putting a lot of money into their research and development, and they're even developing new specialty drugs that even treat common diseases such as diabetes and hypertension, because they feel that with these drugs there may be a better way of controlling those disease states. But so they're just another way of trying to kind of reinvent themselves to provide additional medications to cover not only just general and common diseases, but more specifically disease states that are unique because of genetic factors or whatever. The other reason I think that you see a lot of high costs on specialty drugs is because of orphan drugs. And you may have heard this term and may not know what it is, but what is an orphan drug? And an orphan drug is really a drug that's used to treat a disease state that affects fewer than 200,000 people. So it's not a very large segment of the population, but because you have a very limited number of people that a drug may help, the drugs get very expensive because of the research and development that goes into developing that product for what are called orphan drugs or orphan drug state drugs. And also the other thing why you're seeing pharmaceutical manufacturers put more R&D or research and development into these orphan drugs is because there's a faster FDA approval process and they have a longer patent protection, which means that they have the ability to recover those costs and make more money over time to treat those orphan diseases, or for those pharmaceutical drugs are being used to treat those orphan diseases, and that helps them recover those R&D costs over time. Example, there's a new one that just came out that in the last few weeks where it was announced that the FDA was going to approve a new ALS drug that was being fast-tracked by the FDA. Well, that's kind of an example. All the Jerry Lewis telethon, all the money that has gone into research has now found a drug that can help some ALS patients. So that has allowed them to seek this fast-track status for an orphan drug, and they'll get it approved quicker, and will also be able to maintain their patent protection for a longer period of time. Cancer drugs. I mean, cancer drugs I think last year there were like 11 or 12 cancer drugs that were released to the market. All of them had a price tag of $100,000 or more. And again, cancer drugs account for about a third of all the specialty drugs that are in the pipeline currently. And there was another one that just came out for melanoma, but it can also be used for other cancers. And I was reading a statistic that part of the reason why there's so much money that's being put into cancer drug research and development by pharmaceutical manufacturers is because there are some estimates that by the year 2030 that 75% of the population worldwide, I mean this is worldwide, could have some cancer that could be treated by a cancer drug. So that's why there's a real emphasis on this. And the other thing I think is really interesting is that because of the 340B program and Medicaid, which have really technically Medicaid gets the best price, is if you're a new drug to market and you're the only one, if you set the price, you got to set the price fairly high, because otherwise if you set it low, it's much harder to raise that price after the drug is released in the market, because Medicaid or Medicare and even the 340B program, they're going to be unwilling to pay much more, so that some of these drugs are set at a higher price because of the expansion of the Medicaid and Medicaid and 340B programs.
So when you think about, what are kind of the top 10 lists, so to speak, of specialty drugs, right? They tend to treat a lot of different disease states, but the primary one is, like I mentioned, inflammatory conditions, so rheumatoid arthritis. Those are the Enbrel and Humiras for you that are assuming, taking up a big part of your drug spend. And then multiple sclerosis, right? So you get MS, you get a lot of, unfortunately, right, MS tends to be something that tends to be female predominant. So you get a mom that's got, 3 kids that's in their early 40s perhaps, and she gets diagnosed with MS. So now you got, the MS thing coming through. Historically, the MS drugs have been injectable. They are coming out now with some oral MS drugs to kind of help eliminate, that aspect of it, so it's no longer an injectable thing. But you got oncology, cancer drugs coming through. That used to be a lot of the cancer drugs were used, primarily to put the disease into remission. But now with some of these oral drugs that are coming out, not only does it put them into remission, now the physicians are keeping them on the patients from a maintenance perspective. So if this is a drug that's costs $100,000 a year and they get the patient on remission, but now they put them on for maintenance, that they're taking it every day or every month, every week to keep them on maintenance of that becomes a pretty significant expense that you as the employer is going to incur on an ongoing basis. HIV has always been a big issue. Growth deficiencies, if you get growth hormones and coming through on that, CNS stuff, number 8, anticoagulants. If any of you have a child, a boy, that's hemophilia, right? Because hemophilia is something that only affects males. It's kind of one of these hereditary things, that, so you've hired someone who has a son that's a hemophilia, that what the cost is to try to manage that side effect of that. Hemophilia is one of those diseases that, people think, well, they blow their nose and they start to bleed and they can't stop bleeding. Well, typically not really what's going on here. In most cases, what happens is that within their joints, the little capillaries, the little blood vessels in there break, and so and your body tries to, reabsorb that, and it ends up damaging the tissues within the joint. So these young boys or boys can end up getting knee replacements, hip replacements, shoulders, elbows, the joints that get impacted pretty significant on that. So the advantage of keeping them on the anticoagulants, the hemophilia factors is extremely important. But one thing that's not on this list, which is going to, as Michael mentioned, is the whole hepatitis C aspect. That's going to grow and become one of the items that's going to be on this list as more and more people get diagnosed with or get put on some of these newer hepatitis C medications, right, that actually are cures that can really eliminate the hepatitis from their system, the virus.
Next, we'll spend a little bit of time talking about, the specialty benefit architecture as a part of your plan design. And this is a pretty big topic. There's a lot to think about when you're thinking about this. How do I structure my specialty plan design? And I think that there are a lot of different factors to consideration. But I think that this first point on this slide is kind of captures really what you should think about, and that's making sure that the right doctor is giving the right drug to the right kind of patient for the right diagnosis in the right type of setting. And there's a lot there to think about, but the issue really is, where do I cover this? And we'll still talk a little bit more about do I cover this on the pharmacy benefit? Do I cover this on the medical benefit? Because I think at the end of the day, for anybody, whether you're paying for a specialty drug, whether it be through your pharmacy benefit or your medical benefit, what you really need to be looking at, what is the best outcome? Is the best outcome to be on the pharmacy side, or is the best outcome through my health insurance on the medical side? And that's the tough part, and I think that's where as employers and sponsors of health benefit plans, that you really need to work not only with your PBM, but you also need to work with your health plan to make sure that you're getting the outcomes for that you're looking for based upon what you're paying for, whether it be through the pharmacy benefit or the medical benefit. I think that a lot of times the PBMs and health plans don't talk to each other. They have different. They look. The PBM may have an NDC code. The medical plan may have a different code that they may be using. But you really have to look and see where is it covered and what makes the most sense. And part of this is that there are a lot of different factors that can cause wasteful spending when it comes to specialty drugs. And if you're spending $100,000 a year for a patient, or $150,000 or $125,000 for somebody that's on Hep C or any specialty drug, you really want to make sure that there's some kind of evidence-based medical reasoning, or for the particular treatment that they're getting. Otherwise, you're just wasting money. If somebody cannot substantiate why that individual patient should be on that particular specialty drug and getting the outcome that you're looking for or expecting, then it's just basically could be a waste of money. The other part of it is member non-adherence, and I think Greg had talked about a little bit about why it's important to possibly consider having an exclusive specialty arrangement with your PBM, or it could be through your health plan or whatever. And part of that is because of making sure that members are adhering with the treatment. Are they taking the drug? Is the specialty pharmacy calling prior to the time that they fill their specialty drug to make sure that member is taking their drug? And if they're not taking the drug, why? And also the next thing is the lack of visibility that sometimes plan sponsors have into the medical utilization patterns and spend. I know a lot of times everybody, for example, PBMs have gone out and bought, infusion centers. Well, that's great if you move it to the infusion center, but if the infusion center is not communicating with the patient's doctor and telling them this is what's going on, and the doctor's in the dark about what the member is getting in terms of infused therapy because of a specialty drug, then it doesn't do them any good, and you get a lot of replication and really not knowing if the medication is working for that particular patient. So the bottom line is really making sure that the PBM and the medical plan are on the same page and working in your best interest. And I think somehow we've talked with clients this year. We said, look, you really have to take the lead in trying to get this information and trying to figure out, where are you getting the best outcomes and where is the best place from a cost standpoint to do this. It's work, but it's one of those things I think that you have to do. I cite a study here that a recent study I was reading the other day that talked about Johns Hopkins and a study done by Johns Hopkins and the University of Pennsylvania that said that nearly 30% of cancer treatment did not meet medical-based evidence standards or could not be medically justified. Well, like I said, if you're spending $100,000 plus for a cancer drug, that's not a very comforting figure when you think about whether or not this is actually going to work. The bottom line is, I think as plan sponsors, is that you need to be aggressive in terms of how you manage your specialty drug spend in order for you to control costs. Along the same lines, it's really, the next step is really channel management. Where should that member or that plan participant be, getting their specialty drug? And they're really, at a very high level, there really are 3 to 4 different places that member could get their specialty drugs. One could be through an outpatient setting in a hospital. Second one could be at the physician's office. Third setting, it could be an infusion center, or they could also be getting it through their specialty pharmacy, and working through the PBM. But the question is, going back to what I said earlier, it's really understanding, how much am I spending on my pharmacy benefit, or for how much am I spending for specialty drugs under the medical benefit? How much am I spending under my pharmacy benefit for specialty drugs, and where should it be covered? The reality is that the outpatient setting is the most expensive site for care administration of specialty drugs, and it's about, on average, 2 to 3 times higher for somebody to go into the hospital to have the drug infused or get their specialty drug treatment, as opposed to a physician's office or home infusion or even a specialty pharmacy. So that's the first thing I think that in looking at your drug spend on a medical versus a pharmacy side is really looking at how much of your specialty drugs are actually being administered through an outpatient hospital setting. And if that's the case, is if there is really not a valid reason to have that individual having the specialty drug through a outpatient hospital setting, then looking at moving that to another area. The other thing is do you put as a part of your plan design, like if I figure on injectable drugs, okay, fine. If you have a specialty drug that's injectable, I'm willing as a part of the plan to let you go back to the doctor, a couple times to get trained on how to inject that drug. But after a couple times, it's I don't want to be paying the physician fee for administering that drug. You can do it at home. The PBM we work with will either have a nurse or somebody on the specialty pharmacy side that will call and work with you or train you also as well on getting that, on how to give that injection. So there are little things like that you can do to kind of look at in terms of also lowering your costs on the medical side. And the thing is that just because I think that, like, for example, on a buy and bill program, I know a lot of times the PBM say, well, it's always cheaper to do it on the pharmacy side as opposed to being, going through the doctor's office. And that may or may not be true. And again, that's one of those things that you need to look at to really determine whether or not that channel management or site of care is really better, maybe in the physician's office, even though it may be a little bit higher, but at the outcome that you're getting is better, then it may be a better place for that member to get their drug as opposed on the pharmacy side. But I think that, again, the key is working together with your health plan as well as the PBM to make sure that they are working in coordination for you to make sure that whatever the specialty drug that's being administered to your member is appropriate.
Let's talk a little bit about specialty benefit plan design, right? I think for most of you, I suspect, you cover your specialty medications kind of under your standard benefit design. So, right, they're either covered under your, most of you, I suspect, have a 3-tier copay structure. We have generics, preferred brands, and non-preferred brands. And so I suspect most of you are covering those under either your preferred brand or your non-preferred, most likely your preferred brand copay. And typically that's not a very equitable cost share. Usually what we try to do with our clients is try to get the cost share, from what they're paying of their specialty drugs somewhere around 20%. And you think about 20% works for, typical retail brand and generic drugs that you can get at your local pharmacies or through mail service, but when you got a specialty drug all of a sudden that's, $2,000, $5,000, and the member's only paying $40 for that, it's not a very equitable cost share when you start to think about it. But, and also with your standard plan design, it's kind of hard to manage the specialty product utilization if it's just kind of flowing through. I know a lot of you had open pharmacy networks or specialty networks where they could go wherever they wanted, right? So it's hard to kind of manage that specialty drug utilization, as we'll talk a little bit about. And plus you can end up getting, a lot more waste or excess drug use kind of going through there unless you have more specialty management around that to think about. So I think, one of the things we talked to a lot of our clients about is, kind of putting in these specialty copay tiers, right? Either like a fourth tier specialty for, preferred specialty drugs and a fifth tier for non-preferred, because even within specialty drugs now, within given therapeutic categories of drugs, there are preferred and non-preferred agents that could work. And Kelly, we kind of have a question here to kind of ask people, about this. Do you have a separate kind of copay tier for your specialty drugs, or do you just kind of roll them in under your standard benefits? Yeah, so it looks like, right, yeah, 3/4 of you just, have those kind of coming under your standard benefits, which is not unusual. But I think thinking about, do I want to put in a fourth tier for that? Is there perhaps a fifth tier, to get preferred, non-preferred within your specialty is important. But I think one of the key things you got to think about is, if I say I have a $40 preferred brand copay and I want to move that up to $100, right? So that extra $60 that the member is going to pay for that medication, what will that do to their compliance? If they're, someone that's only making $30,000, $40,000 a year, can they afford that extra, $60 a month for medication? Or will they think, gosh, I don't know if I can afford to do that anymore? Or if you want to put them on a, percentage copay, can they afford to do that? So that's where you always got to, it gets tricky when you start putting in copay levels for that, because you really want to get, maximize the compliance, get people compliant, taking their medications, and it's really the outcome you're looking for, not only on, the medication side, but having medical ramifications to that as well. So it's really important to, really think about, from a plan design perspective, where you set those copays to make sure people can stay compliant with their therapy, and ultimately you get the outcomes.
Yeah, and one thing I just want to mention about that, I mean, a lot of these specialty drugs and pharmaceutical manufacturers do have copay assistance programs that your members can avail themselves of, and also in working through your PBM. So there are, if you do raise your copay or have a fourth and fifth tier, and even if you don't, but even if the member is still having difficulty paying for the cost of that specialty drug, at least on the copay side, they do have programs that you can, work through your PBM to help your member get that copay assistance.
Yep. So, and one of the things, though, you want to look at from a plan design perspective is really the day supply. Our recommendation to all of our clients is that they never allow more than a 30-day supply of a specialty drug. And why do we want that? Well, because I think specialty drugs, in a lot of cases, you really want them to be very high touch. The patients that are on these drugs have a lot of side effects to them. You want to make sure these people are compliant with them and taking their medications. So what we require of all the PBMs that we do business with for our clients is that they, especially that's another advantage of this exclusive specialty arrangement, is that the specialty pharmacy has to reach out to that member, 5, 6, 7 days before the month's over, and ask them, how you doing on your therapy, right? How much do you have left? Because theoretically, if they're calling them on day 25 of 30, they should have about 5 days of therapy left. If they have 10 days of therapy left. How come? Right? Why do you have 5 extra days? Have you not taking it appropriately? Has your physician discontinued it? Are you having side effects with it that you're not comfortable with? What's the whole aspect of that? And the value of limiting these day supplies to 30 is that every month then we know that specialty pharmacist is reaching out to the patient, talking to them about their therapy, talking to them about their disease, asking them how they're feeling. In a lot of cases there's a lot of depression and anxiety that's centered around a lot of these disease states as well. The clinical pharmacist or the specialty pharmacist can, help handle some of that, maybe referring them off to, the appropriate physicians to help treat some of those things. There's just a lot of issues that go along with being on these specialty medications, and I think the value of limiting the day supply to 30, not only from a cost and waste perspective, but also from a clinical management perspective is extremely important. We talked a little bit about formularies. So there are a number of PBMs that are starting to have kind of specialty formularies. So you get preferred, non-preferred drugs within there to help, improve the utilization of kind of lower cost therapies within that category that, are just as efficacious, just as effective as the other medications, but at a lower cost, which is important when you're thinking about these specialty drugs, which are really maintenance drugs that people are going to be on typically for the rest of their life. Refill too soon at it. Where do you set that edit at? I think that part of what we talk about, limiting the day supply to 30 days and having that refill too soon at it set there so it's appropriate. So when the pharmacist does reach out, that they can't get it filled too early. Again, when you think about standard plan designs, a lot of you may allow, 2/3 of the medication to be completed at a retail setting, for example. So if you get a 30-day supply, they may be able to refill it after 20 days. Having a refill too soon at it set, that's more tightly managed than that is to your advantage, right? It cuts down on utilization, overutilization and waste of this. And then really kind of prior authorization and step therapy. I think the specialty pharmacies and stuff really want to try to look at that. As Michael mentioned, you want to make sure that the people are on the medication, it's appropriate for them. So a lot of times you want these things to have a prior authorization to them. You want them to stop, have someone actually look at the medication to make sure, for example, if they're on Kalydeco, which is a drug for cystic fibrosis, really only about 5% of the patients that have cystic fibrosis have the right genotype to qualify to be on Kalydeco. And it's $360,000 a year. So you want to make sure that before that patient gets dispensed that all the prior authorization has been put in place, that all the gene therapy has been checked to make sure that it's appropriate for them before they actually get the medication, and so it's really going to be effective for them. And then also step therapies, right? So when you come through, part of the step therapy programs are there less expensive agents that could be used first before they jump right to that really expensive specialty drug? Because in a lot of cases there are, and that can all help kind of manage costs when you're looking at it from a cost perspective.
Yeah, a couple points I want to make about specialty plan designs, and I think that this is something to kind of think about as well. I suspect that what you're going to see is, just as you have generic preferred and non-preferred copays for drugs that are dispensed at mail and retail, I very well expect on the specialty side you're going to see something very similar as more and more biosimilars come out. I think you probably will end up having what we call a generic specialty or biosimilar or biogenerics specialty tier plan. You'll have preferred specialty drugs and non-preferred. So you could have three copay tiers on the specialty side as you would on the mail and retail side. And the other thing I just want to mention a little bit on the prior auth in terms of a plan design, which is a question that we've been getting a lot this year, particularly as it relates to the Hep C drug, and will also apply to other drugs that are in the pipeline as they come out, is, where do I cover this drug? I mean, if you have somebody that a Hep C patient that's been asymptomatic for a long time, and now they've, because doctors have been quote unquote warehousing patients because they knew that Sovaldi was coming out. They know that the combo pill that is now coming out for Hep C, that they've been kind of waiting for patients to get those drugs. But if somebody has been, maybe stage 1 or asymptomatic for a long time for Hep C, and you're faced with an $84,000 to $125,000 cost, do you cover that? I mean, do you look at that and put a plan design that says, okay, look, I'm not saying I'm not going to cover it, but you got to be at this stage before we'll actually, cover it, because what happens if you have an employee that gets coverage and you paid $100 and some thousand for a drug and then they leave? I mean, you've just paid for their treatment. So I think part of it is looking at it rationally, again, in terms of providing an affordable benefit about, looking at these drugs, working with your consultant, working with your PBM, working with your health plan to say, where should I cover this drug? Does it make sense for me to cover it on day 1 because, a baby boomer, you had a bad needle or used a bad needle or something when they got a tattoo in the 70s or 80s, but they haven't had Hep C or are not showing any kind of, really problems with their liver or whatever. So that's just something to kind of think about is when do I cover those drugs?
So when you think about the utilization management, appropriateness of therapy, right? You need to have some pretty clinically sound, kind of evidence-based criteria for the utilization of these drugs, particularly, when you think about the naive fields. When we say naive, what we mean is that it's the first time the patient's ever been on the drug. So it's the first time they've been on it, they've never had the therapy before, right? You want to make sure that, the specialty pharmacy that you're utilizing kind of goes through and gets a nice clinical sound criteria put in place to make sure that it's appropriate for them. Are they utilizing all that, what I mentioned before, all the pharmacogenomics, those biomarkers, molecular testing? A lot of the oncology drugs now are being very specific to having certain genes and certain, biomarkers in your system for them to work. And if you don't have that, there's less likely that the medication is going to work. So all that stuff is extremely important to have in place before it goes through. You always got to think about safety concerns. These specialty drugs, as I've mentioned before, they have tremendous side effects to them, a lot of them. So you want to make sure that from a safety perspective that, the patient's going to be able to handle it, tolerate it, understands the side effects, and can work through them to make sure they get the outcome that they're wanting. From a utilization perspective, there are a lot of times, though, that physicians will use some of these things for off-label uses. Growth hormone is a classic example, right? You get someone in their 50s, 60s, 70s, that's getting prescribed growth hormone because they think it's a fountain of youth drug and it's going to keep them young, right? So those kind of things, you want to make sure that, that what you're covering is appropriate from a plan design perspective. And again, that's the advantage of having the specialty pharmacy work with the physician, understanding, what's covered under your plan design, at what age do you no longer cover, maybe growth hormone aspects of these things to make sure that they're all being used for, the appropriate labeled use. And I think one of the key things when you think about it is from an appropriate utilization management, especially on, the initial kind of fields of things, is what we're recommending for a lot of drugs, especially the oncology drugs and some of the other things, the oral ones, is that they only get a 15-day supply. Instead of giving them a 30-day supply in the first one, give them just a 15 trial dose to see how they can tolerate it. Like I said, a lot of these oncology drugs have tremendous side effects to them, and the patients may not like them, they may not understand them, but at least if you're only giving a 15-day supply of this, if they can't tolerate it, you're only out for 15 days instead of 30 days, and if it's $100,000 a year, right, you've saved a considerable amount of money. But it also then requires the specialty pharmacy to reach out and touch the patient, after day 7 or 8 or 10 to make sure that they're still taking it, that they understand the side effects, that things are still working for them, and then reorder the balance of the prescription to get out to them so they get their full 30-day supply. So when you think about, on your specialty pharmacies, right, there's a lot of real criteria that you got to look at when you're talking. We've mentioned kind of the value of having an exclusive pharmacy arrangement, specialty pharmacy arrangement. I think there's a lot of value in that from your perspective of how that all gets managed, not only from a clinical perspective, but also from a drug control perspective. So when you think about pedigree validation of the product, what does that mean? Well, it means where are they buying it from? You want your specialty pharmacy to only buy those drugs directly from the manufacturer or through one of the top wholesalers, McKesson, AmerisourceBergen, Cardinal, for example, right? One of the top wholesalers, so that you can track where that was shipped from, where it was manufactured, where it got shipped to, and where it got to the pharmacy. So you can track that whole thing, so you understand that the pharmacy's not buying it from Mexico and dispensing it to your members, right? You want to have that real kind of pedigree validation of the product. You want to have that something from an operational perspective. Cold chain shipping validation. A lot of these drugs require refrigeration. So you want to make sure that from the manufacturer all the way through to the specialty pharmacy, that the cold, that it's been refrigerated and that you can validate that and you put it through. That's something that's extremely important. No auto refills. You never want these specialty drugs to be automatically refilled. As I mentioned before, that we really expect the specialty pharmacy to reach out and talk to the patient, every month before they reship it. A lot of times they're going to want to do that anyway because they want to schedule the shipment to make sure that they're going to be home when it gets there, because a lot of times they get overnighted to them the next day. They want to make sure that they're there when they're present, but you don't really want to set up with an auto refill aspect of it, where it's just automatically shipped out to them, because then you have no way of controlling, whether or not they're still on the medication, if they're having issues with it or whatever. So that's really what we're talking about, confirming that patient's inventory level before shipment. Make sure that they have the right day supply left. Because like I said, it's going to get overnighted to them in most cases. They'll get it the next day. It's not like they're going to run out of medication. But if they, if the patient doesn't accept it, one of the things we want a lot of times the plan sponsor doesn't get charged for it. We want that specialty pharmacy to be responsible for shipping it to the patient when they're there and they're going to be able to receive it, and not just randomly sending it out to them. And then lastly, I talk a little bit about hemophilia assay management. So within hemophilia, it comes in lots, and these lots will have varying degrees of factor within them, and you want to make sure that that gets managed pretty tightly by your specialty pharmacy, that there's not a 10%, 20% grace period, or that it's not getting refilled too quickly, right? Because I said, a lot of times hemophilia is a hereditary thing, so if Johnny's got it, most likely his cousin may also have it. And so, you don't need to be paying for extra hemophilia factor that's being shared with a relative. So it's pretty important from a management perspective and guidelines on the hemophilia side to make sure that the specialty pharmacy is helping you manage those assays. From a clinical management and outcome perspective, right, there's a lot of things you want to try to do. I mean, we've talked a little bit about the management around these things. From a medication perspective, are they taking it appropriately? Is it working? Right? Is they really accomplishing what you're trying to do? The comprehensive initial assessments, when it's a new patient, that naive patient, the first time they're on it, the expectation is of that specialty pharmacist to reach out and talk to the patient and understand all the medications that they're on, what the physician said to them, what their expectations are, kind of do a whole kind of clinical assessment that should take quite a while to do, to make sure that the specialty pharmacist understands what that, all the needs and issues and side effects that are criteria that the patient's going to have, and then really kind of look at that and evaluate those kind of things. Look at what kind of specialty drugs they're on, what kind of just standard prescription things are on, are they on over-the-counter things, and so when you can do this annual comprehensive assessment of them to really assess the effectiveness and the outcome, are they accomplishing what they want to do? If they have multiple sclerosis, are they getting remission from that? Is it being, an issue? Is the medication working? Are they being compliant with it? Are they taking it appropriately, and adhering to the medication, that there's no duplication, that they're not taking a couple of drugs, to treat the same kind of thing. And so, you end up spending extra money just to kind of handle that. And then really assess the dosages. Are they getting the outcome? If not, does that dose need to perhaps be adjusted, right? Either up or down to get the right kind of piece, right kind of outcome coming out of this whole thing. So, right, the ultimate goal out of all this from a clinical management outcomes really is to help reduce costs, decrease the cost of these things, but also, get the clinical outcomes. Don't sacrifice any clinical criteria when you're trying to reduce costs. You want to make sure that you're managing your costs as effectively as you can, but you really need to get those clinical outcomes to make sure the patient stays healthy. So when you think about what's in the pipeline, now as Michael mentioned, there's a lot of drugs coming out. The FDA is expected to approve 25 specialty drugs just this year. So there's a lot of things coming out. The new Hep C drug, the Harvoni, was recently released. The goal along with Sovaldi. So, there's a lot of new stuff that's all coming to the market. And here's just a list of, some of the various drugs that are coming out. When you think about the first one on the list, right, it's $100,000 to treat melanoma, so skin cancer kind of thing. And as that expands and the value of that, right, you start putting people on maintenance for this, it becomes pretty expensive. And you think about, the other drugs that are here, there's a lot of things, chronic hepatitis or cancer, the oncology aspect is really booming. There's all kinds of new drugs coming to market to treat cancer, whether it's skin cancer or breast cancer, a lot of different types of cancer, ovarian cancer. That can be, $110,000 a month, $120,000 a year. So, when you think about what's in the pipeline, it's really going to be important from you from a management perspective to say, right, what's coming on down the pipe? How can I manage these costs? What do I want to do from a plan design perspective to help kind of control some of that stuff? As Michael was mentioning with, the hepatitis C drug Sovaldi, a lot of times the people can be asymptomatic from it. So unless you're really in phase 3 or phase 4 of the disease, you may not want to pay to have this person get Harvoni or Sovaldi. You might want to wait until they actually become symptomatic, and to help kind of manage and control those costs going through. And a lot of that stuff is going to be important that your PBM that you're working with, and especially pharmacy that they're working with, can help you with that. Be proactive on kind of what's going on. Here's stuff coming down the pipe. You may have some patients that are going to do it. Here's some recommendations from a plan design perspective to help manage that cost and the utilization of that, so you do get the appropriate outcome, but it doesn't cost you, so you don't get surprised by the cost coming through the system.
Yeah, I think that to follow up on what Greg said here about your PBM being proactive, and I think whether you're a small client that through a coalition or TPA, or you're with a health plan, or you have a standalone contract, you really should ask them for these pipeline reports. And then I also think it's helpful, and your PBM should know, for example, when somebody is applying for FDA approval for one of these drugs, under what treatment conditions were those drugs approved? Again, they have to follow certain protocols and guidelines, and it's important to really understand, from your standpoint about, where do I cover this, or when do I cover it? And I think that's particularly on the specialty drugs. I mean, the PBMs, they do have pipeline reports. You should ask for that, and should be able to get that, fairly easily. I just want to talk a little bit about biosimilars, because I think that, again, I think that generally with specialty drugs, I mean, it is clearly going to be, it's unsustainable in terms of from a pharmacy benefit with all these drugs, where they're $100,000 plus or whatever costs it may be for covering all these different disease states. And I think that there are a lot of biosimilars that have been used in Europe, and I think that there probably will be more and more pressure on Congress and the FDA to try to have some better or speedier approval process for some of the biosimilars that are could be available on the U.S. market as a way of hopefully controlling costs or lowering costs some. And I think that I think that people, what happens is a lot of times they keep using the term generic specialty drug, and they use that interchangeably, and they think, well, it's like a generic drug, for Lipitor or some other kind of where you can get a atorvastatin or whatever. But they're totally different. As Greg said, these are really brewed. Every one of these is made differently, and just because they're not manufactured like mechanically or whatever you want to call it or based upon a particular component, chemical component, these biosimilars are different, and an individual may react differently to a biosimilar as opposed to a brand drug. And I think that the Affordable Care Act did try to encourage manufacturers to really develop biosimilar type products, and they created this abbreviated pathway for approving biological products that are shown to be biosimilar, which means highly similar. They're not the same, but they're highly similar to an FDA-approved brand drug or a licensed or approved biological product. And by 2018, there are 39 specialty brand drugs that are losing patent protection. So the question is, and Copaxone was one that's coming out with Greg next year, I think.
I think it's already out.
Already out. So that's sort of a biosimilar for treating MS. And so you're going to have all these other different specialty drugs that are currently brands that are going to be losing their patent protection. Some are cancer drugs, some are for autoimmune diseases. And so it's really understanding and knowing what those drugs are, those specialty drugs are losing patent protection, and also is there a biosimilar that's going to be available for that particular disease state. So I think that the thing is that as a plan sponsor, you really need to think ahead about these specialty generics or biosimilars as a part of your plan design. I mean, I think that do you put a step therapy in or a prior auth? Because if there's a biosimilar and they take it, and it could be 20% cheaper than whatever the brand is, but if they don't tolerate it for whatever reason, then they may have to go back to the brand. But those are the kinds of things that you need to be thinking about and planning ahead in terms of what do I do from a plan design standpoint when these biosimilars do come to market. Because again, I think that there's no way that employers can continue to pay. I mean, if you start looking at what you're paying on a monthly basis or a quarterly basis for some of these specialty drugs, it's just unsustainable, because the reality is if these drugs are available, the physician is going to prescribe them. When a specialty manufacturer or pharma manufacturer representative goes in the doctor's office, he's trying to sell a product, and the doctor isn't thinking about, well, such and such company is going to be paying $100,000 for this drug if I prescribe it. They're just going to prescribe it because it's available, and they think that their patient may meet that criteria for having that drug. So I think I think biosimilars are going to be a bigger part of the market. I think it's probably a matter of time. I think that when larger employers start putting pressure on Congress and the FDA to speed up the approval process for some of these biosimilars and that are available in Europe, will they be available in the United States sooner than later? I think we have a couple of minutes here. Just want to talk a little bit about your PBM contract, or in certain things you should be looking at in terms and including in your PBM contract. Of course, definitions and what is a specialty drug is extremely important, and including provisions in your contract about what you expect that specialty pharmacy to provide in terms of when they're going to reach out to the member, or when are they going to fill those a specialty drug. And the other thing you need to ask for is really the ability to audit that. You want to make sure that if you've contracted with that PBM to provide, or their specialty pharmacy to provide those certain services to your members because you're paying the cost, that you have the ability to basically say, I want to see the records. There may be phone calls. I just want to make sure that you're actually doing that. And it's asking for that ability to make sure that you can audit the PBM's operational standards to verify that. The pricing and rebate guarantees, I think that we're starting to see. It used to be you just have like sometimes the PBMs would just put a cost for a specialty drug, but I think that really what you should be asking for is really a pricing guarantee for both, taking into consider the generics that are out there, because there are biosimilars, and there really should be a separate pricing guarantee for biosimilars or generic specialty drugs, and a separate pricing guarantee for brands. We've even started negotiating for an overall effective discount for specialty drugs that take into consideration the biosimilars and the brand drugs, and because you have to look at the overall cost, because even if you can get 1% or so off your drug costs on your AWP, it's going to help. The rebates, guarantees. I think that for a lot of you that don't know, or maybe if you do, I mean, the other thing you need to look at is really kind of amending your definition for rebates to now include what are called price protection or price adjustment provisions that now pharmaceutical manufacturers have negotiated with most PBMs. There are some PBMs that have still not negotiated what are called price protection guarantees or price protection provisions, which basically say that if the AWP of a specialty drug or any drug, let's say they set a cap at 5% and the AWP exceeds that 5% cap, that money then goes back to the employer or the plan in the form of a price protection. So let's say you have a cap on an AWP of a drug of AWP plus, and then there's a 5% cap. If the cost goes up 5, 6, 7% above that, that money goes back to the employer. And then I think finally, the thing you need to start adding or thinking about adding to your PBM contracts are more performance guarantees around specialty and the outcomes that you're expecting from your PBM.
So kind of what are some key takeaways from our webinar here? I think the specialty drug architecture is really important. Where do you cover that? Do you cover it on your medical side or do you cover it on your pharmacy benefit? It's not always cheaper to cover it on the pharmacy side, but a lot of times it makes sense to cover it one place or the other, but that's really important to work with your health plan to kind of do that. Channel management, right? Within the whole channel, where do you cover it? Do you cover it in the physician's office? Is it an outpatient setting? Is it through a specialty pharmacy? Where do you cover that? Where's the most appropriate way to deal with that? Do you think about having copay tiers? Do you get preferred, non-preferred copay tiers that take into account the biosimilars, the biogenerics that are coming to market, so that you can drive utilization to the appropriate thing to lower costs, maximize rebates in a lot of cases, and help give you that overall clinical quality. You want to limit the day supply to 30. You never want to be able to give someone more than a 30-day supply of a specialty drug. You need to make sure that specialty drug is appropriate, that they've gone through all the criteria, that all the the testing, the pharmacogenomics, all that's been done to make sure that it's appropriate, that it's actually going to work when the patient takes it. You got to say that at pharmacy operational requirements, you got to make sure these requirements are in place and make your PBM commit to it. If you're using an open specialty network, it's still contracted by the PBM, so you got to make sure you got that in place. You got to assess the clinical outcomes. That's really key to the whole thing. And then plan ahead, right, for the new to market specialty drugs and biosimilars that are coming out. Be prepared for what's coming down the pike.
Well, it's 2 o'clock. It's water the wrong way. Are there any questions anybody has?
Michael, we have gotten one in that was just one quick one. Well, actually, we've gotten a couple now. One was, when did Copaxone come off the patent? Are there generics available, or are they under the 6-month protection waiting for the generic? And I apologize if I messed up the name of that drug.
No, so Copaxone did lose its patent this year. At this point, though, there aren't any biosimilars on the market. It did lose its patent protection, though. So the biosimilars are not yet on the market yet. They're still, manufacturers and stuff are still waiting for them to bring them onto the market, but it has lost its patent protection. So hopefully we'll have them first part of next year.
And then there was one that says, I'm a grandfathered plan. Is there anything I can do to control our specialty drug costs?
Yeah, but that's a loaded question in some respects. I think part of it is, and we get a lot of questions from grandfather plans or about what to do, and I think a lot of it is it depends what you're looking at doing from a plan design standpoint. I mean, I think that clearly if you're a grandfather plan, you're looking at doing maybe a high deductible health plan. There's certain things you could do. I think at the end of the day, what you need to do is really kind of do a cost-benefit analysis to decide, okay, under the grandfather plan, there's certain things I'm not required to do under the Federal Care Act in terms of different things I have to provide. And you have to look at that. I mean, I think that if you're concerned about your specialty drug costs, and you do have a lot of specialty drugs, it's just something you have to look at about, how do I balance that? Which makes the most sense? Do I maintain the grandfather status? But if you've got really, really low copays and you've got a $5, $10, or $5, $15, $25 copay structure for preferred and non-preferred brands, that you're going to bear a lot of the costs on a lot more because of the way the copay structures or cost share structures are set. And I think it's just something you need to look at. I mean, we've talked to several clients who are grandfathered about what they needed to do that, but it's really kind of looking at the overall totality of your spend from both medical and what you don't currently have to provide versus what you would have to provide, and And you can certainly work with your broker and trying to figure out what that is versus what savings would I achieve on the specialty side in terms of controlling that side. So again, where specialty starts getting to be 50% of your drug spend, it's something to consider.
Okay, well, I think that's all the questions that we have time for now. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. Michael, Greg, thank you so much for a fantastic presentation. The slides will be available. The presenters will be sending them to all of our participants in the next day or two, and the full recording of this session will be available on the University Conference Services website. It's www.ucs-edu.net. Thank you again for everyone joining us, and Michael and Greg, excellent job. And we look forward to seeing you all at one of our 2015 conferences next year.
Thank you. Take care. Have a good day.